but it's not really going to be hitting the UK as seriously. The UK banks were denying their involvement, and at the same time, the UK government was denying that this was going to be as serious as it was. And as I say, we saw still this frothy activity emerges. And I think the interesting thing in terms of explaining this to editors is if the stock market is going up, people believe that much more than they believe the fact that credit markets are going down. It's an interesting thing. If you're how to explain to editors bond markets, credit markets, residential mortgage-backed securities markets, these markets actually matter more in the long run than the stock markets. And I think the history of, in my view, in financial journalism, my experience has always been when there's a struggle between the bond market and the stock market in understanding an event, in the long run, I believe the bond markets usually win. The bond markets understand it better than the stock markets, who have a lot of small investors. But it was very hard to convince editors that it was that serious. I mean, my series did go on the front page and get a lot of views, but it's hard to get that much coverage for this on the front pages and on the news bulletins. And as I say, really, the IMF was the one source we could get stories on. The Bank of England was still very optimistic. Its financial stability reports, now looking back, are incredibly optimistic compared to what was happening. The guy who wrote those, Sir John Geeve, eventually lost his job over this. And you know, the private sector was really saying there was no problem. And to say it was very hard to sell this domestically as something that was a story affecting UK people as well as something that was affecting the US. Now, what I want to do is now go to that next phase, the phase that everyone knows about, the crisis phase, October, and just say a little bit about a comparison between how this was played in the US and the UK. And here I'll just, again, the personal thing is I was assigned to start working on the Obama election campaign exactly the week of the Lehman crisis. I went in the US for that. So I kind of saw it in a way from both sides. And I think in a way the most significant thing for journalists, and perhaps for how this crisis was resolved, the fact that this crisis, the Lehman crisis, occurred in the middle of an election campaign in the US. I think this is extremely important in explaining how it was resolved and how it was covered. Because clearly, some of the decisions being made, for example, the way Paulson was negotiating hardball with Lehman, were affected by political considerations. Would the Congress accept a bailout having done something with Bear Stearns, or would the Republican right actually criticize him if he'd tried to give any more money to Lehman? That was his fear. That was why he was playing hardball and probably misplayed the situation pretty badly. Would the Fed be able to challenge the Treasury? And although there's pretty good evidence the Fed wanted a bailout and really wanted a bailout since 6 months ago, since before Bear, the Treasury couldn't, if the Treasury wasn't going to do it, the Fed really didn't feel able to go out on a limb, particularly in this period when everyone was trying so hard to be bipartisan because you were in the middle of an election campaign. And as we saw, even after the collapse of Lehman's and the rescue of AIG and the fact that the entire world financial system was in complete crisis, Congress still didn't pass the bailout plan at the first go. There was this fierce debate. There was resistance both from the right and the left, the idea that this was going to be a gift to the banks and the gift that this was going to be socialism, the left and right united against it. And in a way, it was only the intervention of Obama in getting the Congressional Black Caucus to swing around to voting for this that got this bailout plan through. And I mean, there are a lot of things to criticize about the bailout, and we did do that. But I think no government intervention at all in the middle of this crisis would have been a recipe, I think, for a much bigger scale disaster than what we did have. Now, what we had in the UK was in a sense, a different process. First of all, we had a similar thing to Merrill Lynch, Bank of America. We had, again, the BBC revealing that Lloyd's now is going to do another deal. Again, an unwise deal, as it turned out, just like Bank of America and Merrill Lynch, in rescuing and taking over HBOS, formerly the Halifax Building Society, one of the biggest mortgage lenders. So Lloyd's again came in the second time to try to save one of the banks without having to have massive government intervention. Again, this proved to be misguided. In the end, it meant that Lloyds itself had to be rescued by the UK government. And again, I think by the BBC mentioning this and the BBC saying that banks were in trouble, we started to get another version of the shoot the messenger thing. This time it was interesting. The banking system, the banking sector, and even the CBI, the industry, so they started attacking the media, saying, if you guys would stop saying that banks are in trouble, we're sure share prices will recover. And there was a very interesting period where short selling was banned by the FSA, where, again, there were calls for the FSA to actually regulate what was said about banks, and the belief, again, that this crisis could be stemmed purely by not having any messengers giving any information about it. The other fascinating thing in the UK, and the bit of drama that I think was quite interesting, was that all of this for the first time and all of these debates were played out in public, because we had the formerly dormant Treasury Select Committee calling all these people to account, calling the Bank of England to explain itself, the government and the FSA to explain itself, and I think we got tremendous drama and tremendous understanding. I mean, the FSA, the Financial Services Authority, for example, admitted in the hearings that when they said they were lightly regulating Northern Rock Building Society, they really meant it. They only had one meeting with them in 5 years, and they'd lost the notes of that meeting. So they didn't know what was said at all in terms of the regulation, whether they'd warned them or anything. The Bank of England managed to recover itself, vigorously defend itself, and blame the Treasury for all the problems. And we then got the extreme spectacle of the bankers, like the head of Northern Rock, then the head of RBS, the head of Lloyds, everyone coming before the Select Committee and saying sorry. They had this great scripted moment where they said, we're all very, very sorry for all the damage we caused. We were very, very wrong. We're really sorry. Now, they still kept their very large pensions, which was a bit of a contentious point, but they were forced to say sorry. Now, the other interesting thing about the coverage, I think, in the UK compared to the US was, obviously from the UK point of view, and I'd say from the European point of view perhaps a little bit, this was a global story, and what was required was global action. I don't think that was ever seen as the case in the US. I may be wrong. I think when Obama came to Europe and when Britain organized the G20 meeting in April 2009, there was very much the hope and belief that actually this crisis was big enough and important enough and having so much damage now everywhere in the world, every country, third world countries, Europe, Asia was all hurting, that you would get a global response. And obviously there was some interest in the US in doing that, but I think from the US point of view, crises are never really global. They're always kind of a US crisis first, and the rest of the world second. I think from a medium-sized country like Britain, there's much more of a hope that this is going to be a global crisis with a global response and a global Keynesian stimulus package. So the UK government invested a huge amount of time and effort and publicity in pushing the G20 April London summit, and we covered it quite a big way. But I think it was clear at that summit and in the early stages that in the end, governments, even the UK government, was not going to really give up that much sovereignty. They weren't going to agree global stimulus packages beyond what they were already planning on doing, and they weren't going to agree to a global regulator that had power to tell national regulators what to do. As we've seen even in Europe, this has proved quite difficult. So we had a bit of a, I don't know if we call it a false dawn, but we certainly had an interesting time trying to describe what a global rescue plan would look like and how far we could go on that. I think the other significant thing, obviously, in the crisis was the rise of the BRICS and the importance of China, India, and so forth in this, which we saw was the main result of the G20 meetings, really. Now, just one quick thing to say is another issue for us at the BBC was how much to call the recession, how much to try to look at when it might be recovery. Because we started putting up a graphic with a line going down saying UK in recession. And this proved quite controversial, this single line, because people said, you're depressing everything. If you don't tell it like that, house prices will start going up again, everyone will be happy again. And continually in a country like Britain, the issue is, are we the weakest? Are we the worst in terms of recovery, in terms of, and now it's clear, for example, that Britain is the country that has been